that life is often beautiful, and when it is, people can experience that. But it is also often painful and mundane when people are forced to survive under the brutality of the capitalist system and contend with life's roadblocks, such as mental illness, grief, and sickness. I'm going to start by modeling how this drug would be legalized and then talk about four things. Firstly, autonomy. Secondly, capitalism. Thirdly, mental illness and pain. And finally, about why criminalization is a worse counterfactual. Into our model. It would be legalized
Recording in
and
progress.
regulated, but it would be regulated quite loosely. I think firstly, minors would probably not be allowed to take it. And the second piece of regulation is that there would probably be an upper limit on how long people can put themselves under the drug for and how much you can sell at a particular point in time. So perhaps this would be capped for a few weeks. You would not allow someone to put themselves under drip for the remainder of their life. The drug exists in both worlds. In ours, it is legal. More people use it. In theirs, it is criminalized. Fewer people use it. And if they do, they get punished. Firstly, on autonomy. I think that generally speaking, the state should be as minimalist as possible in terms of banning things. Firstly, no one agreed to exist under a state and have any degree of enforcement over their life decisions. And secondly, given that people have different conceptions of what the good life is, a blanket conception of the state ought not be enforced. This is why we allow people to do things like drink and smoke under the status quo, even though it might be bad for them. Crucially, even if an opt-in can prove that the consumption of this drug might harm other people, I don't think it matters. People did not consent to be born and therefore did not consent to obligations or contracts that we might have with other people. And the coercive nature of existence means that we have a very large claim to control ourselves and to control our bodies. Every experience that I have in life ultimately stems from an initial point of coercion to be brought into the world. And therefore, it's vital to my own autonomy to be able to control the terms of those experiences that I have. And a key way of doing so is being to opt out of these experiences via subjecting myself to a degree of unconsciousness. Crucially, I think that people can make an informed choice about taking this drug because they experience a degree of consciousness. They know what it's like to be conscious for like 18 years of their life before the drug is legalized. And given that we're not going to allow them to put themselves under drip for the remainder of their life, there's also always going to be the capacity to have rethinking of this drug in an opt-out period because you can consent to the somewhat uncertainty of knowing that I don't know exactly what the drug's going to be like, but you know that the certainty of existence might be something that is ultimately uncomfortable for you. Our second argument is about coercion into capitalism, because I think that one of the most likely applications of this drug is people who hate their jobs taking this drug at work. Note that this is still possible because you're still able to like make decisions, retain knowledge, and perform properly. You're just not going to be conscious while you are at work. I think that working capitalism is terrible for a lot of people. Firstly, the job that I take is often determined by the whims of the labor market rather than my underlying interests. So I happen to do things that I hate for prolonged periods of time. Secondly, work is often mundane and repetitive, even if I have an underlying passion. Maybe I like my job, but when you're doing the same thing every day for the rest of your life for 8 hours, you begin to hate it and you begin to resent it. Thirdly, in the workplace, you have a huge lack of autonomy. You might have creative aspirations, but you're always being subjected under an oppressive hierarchy where your boss is basically telling you what you're supposed to do rather than you actually having any meaningful degree of self-actualization within that context. However, people have to partake in the system in order to survive because they need a wage to feed their family. There's two conclusions of this argument. Firstly, this is just another principle about why people have a fundamental right to do this. I think it is horrible that people are coerced into capitalism to be able to survive, and this is the best way to provide people an opt-out of the system without having to make the trade-off of literally starving. Secondly, though, this just makes life a lot more enjoyable for a lot of people. Like how this works is like you take the drug for 8 hours at work, disassociate, still make money. You reap the fruits of your labor in terms of a wage, but you're not like mentally burned out and exhausted when you come home. You haven't endured that suffering. You can just lean into the passions of your life outside of work. Our third argument is about mental illness and emotional distress, because I think that for a lot of people, existence can be quite unpleasant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, just the undergoing of short-term crisis, such as the death of a loved one, illness, or unemployment. But secondly, just long-term chronic sadness, like mental illnesses like depression and anxiety, they're often difficult to treat. I think that might respond by saying, but now people aren't going to get help. They will. Firstly, people still want to experience positive utility and not utility neutrality. When you are conscious and you are happy, that is more of a utility gain. I don't think a lot of people want to be under this drug for their life, therefore they will often still seek getting help as a first alternative. Secondly, your friends and your family will still want to get help because they want to partake in shared memories with you. They're able to actually remember rather than just having a vague recollection. Thirdly, the drug probably costs money to buy, meaning that seeking help is still likely to be a first alternative. The comparative is some people who structurally cannot afford and who can't get help, some people who are just resistant to help, which is like treatment-resistant depression and anxiety, or people who are getting help, but their pain is so bad that in the interim period, they need something to be able to face themselves over. There's two impacts of this argument. Firstly, this literally just removes daily pain of existence for a lot of individuals who really want to die and are just extremely, extremely sad. I think that this is good because utility neutrality is a much better thing than people being actively sad and devastated. Secondly, though, and this is key, this allows people undergoing temporary bouts of sadness to be more functional. I think the problem with depression and mental illness is how bad thoughts tend to spiral. You feel depressed, you can't go to work, but then you get more depressed because you're unable to make a living. You begin to isolate yourself from friends and family because you're comparatively less functional. That just worsens a lot of spiral. What this drug does is it allows people to be functional while alleviating emotional pain, preventing bad mental health from compounding into tangibly bad circumstances that worsen the quality of life for a lot of people. Statistically, most people experience like mental health issues or sadness at some point in their life and we're substantially better for them. Before we go into our final argument, like criminalization is worse, CO.
Do you think people who are substantially depressed, like to the degree that they contemplate suicide or things like this, are going to be better off at the point at which they're intermittently blacking out of existence?
Because I would rather black out of existence than want to die. It is substantially less painful. You might getting help. Like let's say you're starting on antidepressants, and for the first like couple weeks, like that's where you get the worst suicidal thoughts. You can like phase people over until they reach a period of comparatively better mental health. Finally, the comparative is criminalization, and that is bad. There's a few reasons for this. Firstly, people who are severely mentally ill and don't want to die might try and take the drug and they're either side of the house because they're really, really desperate. Now, however, they feel a lot of shame and internalized guilt and they cannot talk to their friends and family about this and get support while using the drug. But also, you literally like criminalize people who are simply in pain. Imagine forcing them to pay a large fine or sending them to jail when they're literally just trying to alleviate the pain that they were experiencing. Secondly, people make a less informed choice about taking the drug. Insofar as people cannot admit to taking it, there's substantial less public awareness and information about the harmful effects of this drug. Insofar as you buy whatever Apple say, like there's consequences to like the drug and it might preclude better outcomes, people are more empowered to make this choice when there's comparatively more access to information under our side of the house. Thirdly, people cannot just discuss how taking the drug feels with others. Like if you're experiencing therapy, for example, you'll feel less inclined to like admit to the therapist you're actually taking the drug. You can't get support from your friends and family about the way that you're using like the drug. If you do feel like you are addicted to this drug, even though I don't think that is addictive because there's always an opt-out period, there's not going to be systems of like treatment that people are able to access in a way that is like destigmatized when the drug is literally something that is criminalized. But finally here, price extortion is substantially worse. Insofar as there are fewer providers because they have to operate underground because there's less competition, people who are desperate and who are going to use the drug are going to be like extorted substantially less. Also, I don't know if it can be like laced or like mixed with other drugs, but probably in a less regulated system, it's also going to be substantially more dangerous. What is the comparative then at the end of this debate? For people whose life is going well, nothing is going to happen to them. The largest thing that could happen to them is maybe someone that they love is taking that drug. I think that even if that's the case, you have no obligations as a person who is suffering to facilitate a better quality of life for other people when you do not consent to those obligations. We help millions of people who are experiencing bouts of sadness get on with life and experience a comparatively greater degree of utility. And for these reasons, I'm extremely proud to stand in opening government.
Great. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for their speech. I would now like to invite the Leader of Opposition to deliver their speech. You're here.
Chairperson, honorable adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, you've probably seen us debate before once or twice, but the truth is we've been nerfed. We've never gotten to do a final with pure philosophy and talking about the mind and the structures of consciousness. You are in our wheelhouse now. Firstly, I want to talk about the mind. And secondly, I want to talk about practicalities because it's always comes second because we're the fucking Irish. Right. On the mind in and of itself, 5 claims here. The first of which, and this trades off with a large degree of what Naomi said, is that consciousness and just experience in and of itself is something which is actually utility positive. Just experiencing things is nice. It's good. People don't realize it because we like to be really like doomer bros online and things like this and debating runs these weird hedonic treadmill arguments that don't stand up in actual philosophy. But it's quite a simple thing, right? The idea, which is normally the reverse of this, is that pain and these things are programmed to be highly receptive because like that's what made us survive in the wild. It's like evolutionary psychology. The problem with this is that within it, it concedes that the mind has an aversion, a major aversion to happiness and pain, and therefore seeks to avoid it and address it. What this means is sometimes, yes, that makes you just like solve your life out, which by the way, we get more when we just don't realize that we were in pain and these kinds of things. But crucially, you actually try to be happy constantly. Your brain is constantly trying to trick you to be happy, to appreciate things. It distracts you when you're depressed and makes you not dwell on it. While yes, that can be harmful sometimes, it ultimately makes life in and of itself utility positive and consciousness. You're depriving that from people for huge amounts of times. Even doing mundane things is actually something which is utility positive on that, and therefore something which should be weighed. Secondly, though, and this is crucial, monotony breaks the hedonic treadmill. And what I mean by this is very simple. People in debating, and just generally, have this idea that you get acclimatized to things in life. So say you get your brand new big cool TV and it's cool for a while, but then you get used to it and it's no longer good. And therefore you can't ever be happy for some reason. But crucially, while this is somewhat true, the way to break that is via monotony. It's the fact that I have to go to work for so long that I then appreciate doing like my favorite hobbies like debating or going to the pub with mates. You get that monotony which contrasts it, because if your main experience, which you have consciously, is just the good parts, the non-mundane, that's when you become fully acclimatized to and it ceases to be fun. That becomes the mundane in and of itself. You need mundane work, you need mundane things to have meaning, to break the hedonic treadmill in order to be happy in anything and have no mundanity. But third of all, the only cure to pain and sadness, ladies and gentlemen, is to understand it. You have to have a phenomenal idea of what it was like to suffer, what it was like to be bored. Because crucially, just this is a big graphics, a trigger warning, but imagine if you're like, say, assaulted for some reason, and then you walk by the place and you have this vague impression that you're scared, that you're in pain, but you don't understand it because you only have like the kind of access consciousness that something bad happened, but you don't know what it was like. Knowing what it's like helps you understand things and process them. You feel just how much that affected you, and while yes, that can be scary in itself, it allows you to know what to overcome. It's far better than generic fear of the unknown and vague impressions making that worse and worse. Fourthly, on the mind, experience and conscious experience gives agency and more autonomy to you moving forward in life. Note if I prove this, it's quite crucial because Naomi talks about like states shouldn't ban shit. We think the burden for states banning stuff is like hindering freedom so as to bolster it. That is to say, if a law currently exists which represses your agency more than it gives you more agency in return, that is wrong. This one is going to do the reverse, because it gives you agency. Crucially, when you are conscious, even the most mundane moments, you can have things like existential realizations. You can be thinking and feel something viscerally that you actually enjoy your work, you actually enjoy this thing. You think about your life generally, and while yes, sure, you get vague impressions, it's not the same, because phenomenal consciousness, which is the idea of the phenomenon of consciousness and experiencing that, is something which is very powerful because it gives full clarity to that experience. It helps you understand in the future if you fully liked it and just how much you liked it, and therefore whether or not you want to do that thing again, or crucially, if some of your work is mundane, or if it's dangerous, and if it's really painful, you know just how painful, and you're able to lobby on that, as we'll talk about later. On your side, you only know roughly it's painful. You don't have that same degree of agency and understanding of your own situation. It's not just like injustice because you don't have the language to describe what's happened to you. You don't fully know what's happened to you. But moreover, you could, like, another existential is, for example, you could like meet someone at work and fall in love, and you feel that love at that moment. But crucially, you don't have the conscious memory of love and what it is in this moment. So when it happens again, you don't realize that that's what you were feeling, if it's for someone else or if it's for the same person. You just think generally, oh, I felt kind of nice. The degree to which this deprives agency from you going forward into the future is massive, and it's an absolute harm. But fifthly, you cannot consent to unconscious action, because Naomi's idea that you can consent to being unconscious is because we know what consciousness is like. That doesn't mean we know what the opposite is. In fact, we don't know what unconsciousness is like because de facto we can't experience things when you're unconscious. And while yes, we do go to sleep, what this debate is, it's the drift is more like sleepwalking, which people often say they have horrible experiences and wish that they didn't suffer from. This is because you can't remember why you did something. You had decision making, but you only have vague impressions of why you did it. You can't remember, and because of that, you can't explain to yourself what it was like and why you did that and attach it to your identity and thus gain meaning for it. But you also can't explain it to other people when they ask questions of you. It's an assault on all levels. The mind is meant to function consciously, and when we are taking actions, and proposition strips this from people because obviously more people take things when it's legal, and that is a fundamental assault. CG.
There are also a lot of biological reasons to feel pain a lot of the time. For instance, if my body wants me to eat and I haven't, I will feel pain predominantly.
This is true, but your mind in response tries to make you be happy or tries to make you ignore it. I literally analyzed it as, yes, sometimes biology makes you feel pain, but your mind, which is the thing you actually experience, does the opposite in response. Crucially then on practicalities, note that on framing, you likely get huge lobbying from the pharmaceutical companies that produce this when it's fully legal, which they can't do when it's legal, which looks like possibly advertising in some countries, because note, most countries don't actually ban things like tobacco advertising, but also, this is just hard to police in and of itself on how many people are taking it, because as per the info slide, externally observing them, they behave as someone who is conscious. So how do you know how much someone is taking it? How do you know these things? I don't think that regulation is even possible, even if it is likely, which is unlikely. But crucially, workplaces probably encourage people to take it. They reward people if they're hard workers and they don't complain about the monotony. Crucially though, OGs say this is inaccessible. workplaces are actually likely to provide it. But if that is true, if they say it's very expensive and that's why people can't take that much, that's also why people who are wealthy are able to be better workers now. And you absolutely push out income inequality even more because people who are less well off can't take it to the same degree, and you worsen inequality for people on the ground. Panel, this is a fundamental assault. I know people are obsessed with practicalities in debating, but sometimes the mind is more important.
Great. I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for their speech. I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver their speech. Here.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. 3, 2, actually, no, same content note as Naomi, given that we are running same case because we are one team and therefore that makes sense. Cool. 3, 2, 1. Look, I had a really nice deputy structure all written out, but I clearly forgot I was debating against the fucking Irish. Okay, let's deal with their stuff on the mind. Then let's deal with the stuff on regulation not happening. Let's do some more responses to CO's POI, hopefully take another POI from CO, and then we're gonna win. Cool. Consciousness is utility positive because your brain will try to keep you safe from pain by allowing you to distract yourself, etc. I would just note that this doesn't actually logically connect because pain amelioration does not equate utility positivity at the end of it. It means that your pain is not as bad as it could be. It doesn't mean that it's above a net threshold of utility. That's not how logic works. This is not true. The second thing that they say is monotony makes the good stuff good. I think that they're being slightly overclaimy here. I think relativity of good things makes good things good. There's presumably still differences in your experience quality, even if you're avoiding the very worst parts of it, because going to sleep and reading a nice book is one utility level, and having the best night of your life with your best friend is a different utility level. And the avoidance of pain is probably something that you are aware of, insofar as you still have vague memories of knowing things like, my workday sucked, man. I think all of those things you probably can still do. Then they say, in order to solve yourself having bad emotions, you need to understand them so that you can overcome, so that you understand specifically what you need to overcome. And they link this to trauma in a way I'm not going to repeat, even though I think it's probably a decent illustration. I think the thing with that is, this doesn't necessarily work. Even if you know what you would need to overcome, you don't know your brain will be able to do it because the association may just be too powerful. I think often in the cases where this is most severe and therefore where their impact is highest, that is most correct, because the association of when you have actually experienced something bad to other things that then make being re-exposed to those other things unpleasant stays incredibly powerful. I don't know how you actually fix for that reliably. If I did, I'd be a lot happier person. However, I think that crucially, when the association is weaker because you don't actually remember all that much about it, yes, you might feel unease and you might feel weird about it, but you can then actually distract yourself. I would posit that if the counterfactual is very likely not actually being able to overcome the trauma, not experiencing it as intensely and getting to think about other things and getting to just not particularly deal with it is probably a better outcome, even if neither outcome is especially good. Fourthly, they say, you reduce your agency because there is potential for you to have realizations and thoughts at the point where you are conscious. I think that the whole realizations and profound brain stuff is really just a fancy way of saying your brain will spit out some stuff at you. Maybe you don't want your brain to spit out stuff at you in response to the environment which you often have no consent into being in, because your brain isn't choosing to spit stuff out at you, it's doing so in response to being exposed to stimuli. Maybe you think those stimuli are shit. I think you should be allowed to control the things your brain sees. You shouldn't literally have to watch every movie in the world because it might make you think clever things. Maybe you should be able to pick which movies you actually want to be in, including in your life. The last thing that they say is you can't consent to this because you don't know what not having consciousness is like. You can consent to risk
insofar as that's what you do with every decision you make, because you never know the totality of experiences that we will have in response to it. I think we can approximate the sensation of not being conscious relatively well through just reducing our understanding of awareness. But also, lots of the time, we've just had a morning where we were really tired and we kind of just wandered onto the bus. If we approximate this drug of being kind of like that, maybe that's pretty close. And we are probably aware of the fact it's not a perfect approximation. At that point, I think you can consent to that risk. In particular, you can say, look, even if I don't know fully what this is like, my actual life sucks so much, I would really just prefer to not be dealing with it today, that I'm willing to take that risk. I think that's fine. Matt.
Genuine question, Kat. If all of your analysis is true, why are you against people using this drug as much as they want to all the time? That is the logical endpoint of your principle, no?
I think the thing is, I don't mind people using this drug a lot. I want them to periodically have consciousness in order to, again, be aware of it, because I think that there are probably risk points to it of not being fully in response to your preferences. And I think also just the input of situation that makes you want to use it can change. E.g., you might assume that you're going to be poor forever, but then something nice happens. You might assume that your boss is going to be shitty to you forever, but something else happens. You being able to reevaluate and see if you still consent to something is, I think, a fundamental thing of consent. And I think that that's something that's quite good. Then, more responses to why you still fix like stuff in your life to the degree that it's possible. I think in addition to what Naomi says about the cost of this drug, I also think that you ultimately are still going to be intellectually very aware of the fact that you have problems in your life, because you have to justify your use of the drug, in particular by reference to the fact that you think it is better than experiencing particular components of what you're going through. You do this by intellectualizing why your situation is bad, meaning that you are aware of it. Secondly, though, I think you still make decisions that are in accordance with your general preferences when you're on the drug, meaning that to the degree that, e.g., like unionizing in your workplace is something that might be good for you, you probably still join a union because that's still in correspondence to your overall preferences. Lastly, I just think that boredom and habit and the fact that work being shit is tiring are massive barriers to you fixing things in your life as a whole, because they make you tired, but also because the more you consciously go through an experience, the more you normalize it in your head and the harder it becomes to envision it being possibly changeable. I think it's just good if people believe they can change their lives, and that's something that I would like them to continue to be able to do. Lastly, with regard to the like therapy mental illness point from Matt, like I think that probably there's limits to the degree to which it's good for people to temporarily fade out of consciousness. I think that's possibly fair. The thing is, I think they will try to do it anyway. I think things like drinking yourself to the point that you can't think straight anymore are still things people will do on opposition. I would posit that those things are just worse because alcohol is incredibly health dangerous and also more addictive in other ways. I have no reason to believe this is addictive. Alcohol probably is. Therefore, this is better. Then we get one practical thing, which is like regulation is unlikely because there's lobbies. Like, okay, I'm going to be real with you. When I initially read the info slide for this drug, I thought it was really fucking creepy. And I think people will continue to think it's kind of creepy for all the reasons that Owl kind of points out. Like, you don't know if the people around you are on this drug, and you don't know what being on it is like. I think the regulations that we propose are pretty minimal. Like, people have to, like, can't just put themselves on an endless supply of it, and you don't sell it to minors who we have a special duty in society to protect. That regulation exists even if there's lobby, because there's massive democratic capital for it. This is just good for a bunch of people when they're ill and when they're suffering. They should be having that benefit. OG.
All right, great. I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech. I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to deliver their speech. Here.
Please give me a moment. Now, the mind is far too beautiful a thing to waste. The first thing I'm going to do is respond to the principle. If everyone is an individual agent in the face of the state, the harm there of coercion is a restriction upon agency. If we're able to show to you that this drug structurally removes people's agency, it is therefore the obligation of the state to come in and prevent people from doing that. We oftentimes step in instances of addiction. We have harms to future self that people cannot consent into over the long term. Secondly, harms that are difficult to predict, oftentimes states opt into, things like central banks, all the boring analysis you've already heard. Therefore, the principle resolves back to the practical of that. What are the responses we heard to our case? Firstly, that safety from pain is not in and of itself utility. I think utility is not like a number. And this is really important because it also means that we don't have the like epistemic faculty to determine what is positive and what is net negative, because that thing doesn't really work. The reality is our brain is full of both pain and pleasure and other different emotions that interact with that. Pain amelioration is a form of pleasure and therefore something that the brain engages with on a constant basis. Secondly, they respond to our idea that the mundane makes things good by saying that you still have a degree of relativity. Here's the problem though. Firstly, you no longer have the floor level of the lowest experience possible, the most mundane experience possible, to make even small excursions from that, which are cheap and accessible, better. Secondly, in the comparative, when you now have the resting state of, the things you experience being the pints you get with your coworkers on a Friday, that then becomes the lowest level. So you push for more and more things, which correlates with more risk to yourself as an individual person, more expense to yourself as a person and to those around you, which is a net negative. The third thing they talked about is understanding. I'll deal with that in the case. Two more responses to OG before I move on to the full extension, or not the full extension, but like the kind of full interaction of the case. On the drinking and drugs thing being the comparative, I think we can use their own mechanisms on the black market to explain why these things oftentimes are socially delegitimized. You can't show up to work drunk. You can't show up to work on drugs. Then responding to the black market, they never prove to you why this drug will be able to be accessed in the black market. Why is there the supply? They only explain the demand. The problem is that pharmaceutical companies won't produce it if they can't sell it for a profit. Now, you still have some drugs in the black market, like cocaine and weed, but those drugs are easy to produce because they're based off of plants. Here's the problem. They never explain to us how this drug is able to be produced. Obviously, they can't because it doesn't exist. So you can't have this analysis in this debate. You need to debate on just the benefits and negatives in and of itself. I also think we can weigh this off on scale. So, two arguments. Firstly, on capitalism. They say to us, that, and this is the first argument, that capitalism is mundane and repetitive and you have a lack of agency. But the mind wants to get more. We become accustomed to our surroundings over time. Like you do things like talking to your colleagues, inventing structures and outlets, like making jokes, complaining about customers, like taking a shit on company time. All those kinds of things mean that over time, you develop the defense mechanisms to find some kind of joy and meaning, even if it's minimum, those kinds of things, which means that the lowest lows that they talk about never really accrue on their side of the house. They never get this in their side of the house, never get these experiences. Secondly, many jobs give you an appreciation of the small things. The fact that you have to work for 5 days a week to go out for a pint with your colleagues on Friday evening means that pint becomes really meaningful. Means that those experiences, those small things become meaningful in your life. And that doesn't just exist over the course of your work week, but just in general. It's the reason why oftentimes on the bus to work, I was working 2 jobs this summer. I would oftentimes look at the sunrise and think, wow, that was really beautiful. But I never thought that just during general periods of time, because I hadn't acclimatized my brain to looking for the small joys in life that give people meaning over the course of their life. Third thing, on just the practical plane, a couple of things on this. Firstly, the main way you're able to lobby for higher minimum wage laws is by saying things like people really suffer, people have a really hard time in these jobs. You no longer have that if most people are using this drug. Secondly, contact theory. Most minimum wage workers are working class, and oftentimes that involves people from migrant backgrounds and just the domestic work class as well, which means that this is the only interaction between these groups that informs politics. So you oftentimes get things like coworkers from different backgrounds having fun with each other, laughing and joking. That means that when populists come to you and say you should hate your neighbor, you say no. You say, no, I shouldn't because I know this guy and I think he's great. That influences the way in which these people are treated outside the context of the job as well. This means 3 things. Firstly, the people that cannot opt back because they no longer develop the defense mechanisms to understand over that period of time how to interact with their job. So they're locked into the pursuit of this drug. Secondly, those who can't afford the drug are at a loss because they're not able to access these kinds of things with people around them. But thirdly, and more importantly, those who can afford it are at a loss as well because they now have to pay on top of their lower wages. Wellness then. A couple of things in this. For those who are mentally ill, the first thing I'd like to note is for all the reasons they gave, the comparative is something like antidepressants. And I know Naomi is correct in saying that there is an adjustment period to antidepressants of a couple of weeks that are oftentimes quite difficult. Firstly, I just don't know why this wouldn't also be the case for this drug. I think I did a bit of neurology this summer and I could probably think of a reason, but I don't think it's in this debate. But just secondly, I think we can weigh off that small period of adjustment against other things. On mental illness, it's a myth to say that mental illness is a chemical imbalance. The mind is made up of things like trauma interacting with our own consciousness and that kind of thing. you must be able to have some sort of evaluation of this and ability to get out of it, because that's how we evolved. The people in the state of nature experienced traumatic incidents, but were able to overcome it. The way they were able to overcome it is by giving it meaning, by giving it safety, by giving it comfort. You can know, even if you walk into a room and it triggers your fear response, or you see someone that you know and triggers your fear response, because you know the nature of that fear. You know that you're safe. You know the people around you are making you safe. When you don't have that meaning, it's extraordinarily harmful for you as an individual. The realizations you get are good. OG say there's negative thought spirals, but notably, those negative thought spirals still happen on their side of the house, but you can't annotate it. What I mean by this is, oftentimes it's really useful, it's a thing you get taught in therapy, that when you're going through negative thought spirals, it's oftentimes useful to allow them to happen, but to note in your own brain and your consciousness, this is not true, and that kind of thing. That allows you the ability to move out of that in the long term. They don't get that. Closing. Okay, I gave a chance for engagement. The last thing to say is just catharsis. I just think it's a really important form of catharsis to be able to experience your own life, to give it the words to explain. Because if you're sore after a week's work, but can't explain to people around you what the experience of that work was, you can't get the connection between other people around you, the common human experience off of which we base our foundational principles of personhood. The last thing to say, though, is I think, oh yeah, they say you intellectualize the taking of the drug, and so you still want to solve your problems. I don't know if you do. I think it probably becomes habit forming, as they themselves say. Maybe the first couple of times you take it, you're like, oh, I remember taking this for this reason. But over time, it just becomes habit. The last thing to say is I just think that we can weigh this off, because if these people are getting some help on their side of the house, I think more mental illness and downtroddenness happens because of the taking of this drug, because of lack of proper information about yourself, because of addiction and dependency, because no ability to understand or explain your problems, no ability to pursue meaning in the course of your life that allows you to do things better. We've explained to you in opening opposition why every time anyone takes this drug, it will be a bad idea. That is the most salient impact in this debate, because it's not dependent on any superstructural impacts. It's dependent on the fundamental principle of the drug in and of itself, and it's the reason why opening opposition have won this debate. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, great. I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their speech. I would like to invite the Member of Government to deliver their speech. Hear, hear.
All right, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. There is a big debate in morality and consciousness. If, say, I do well at debate competition, I make it to the final, I get the enjoyment, the satisfaction as a phenomenal quality. One of my goals, we can infer what I care about based on my behavior, I can have second order thoughts, has also been met. And both of these are reasons why that state of affairs could be good. The Irish have merely asserted that the reason why we care about me doing well is that it makes me gives me phenomenal qualities which are good. We claim that is not the case, that the only thing that matters is whether or not your second order preferences are met, whether or not you fulfill your goals, and not how you feel about them. And therefore, when people take this drug, they are actually more likely to do the things that they want to. Why is consciousness not intrinsically valuable? 4 reasons. The first is, I think our intuitions about morality strongly point in this direction. I do not know if XK is conscious or not, but it would be very bad for me to inflict pain upon them. And that suggests that what I am doing is merely looking at the way that XK responds to my behavior, right? And inferring based on that what their preferences are. I have no evidence for their phenomenological states, which means that our intuitions about what matter based on how we treat other people are grounded in their preferences and not in the way we think they feel. Secondly, we have a strong aversion to the idea that you could hook me up to like a Nozick machine or whatever they call it, where you should inject serotonin into my brain. But that would feasibly give me good mental states, right? I would have the feeling of being happy at that point in time, which suggests that our idea of what makes a good life does conflict with the idea that merely being conscious is not enough to make us happy. Thirdly, I think this is actually what we think makes humans special. We don't think dogs are that important, even though they do have these, we suspect have these ideas of being conscious of pain, which means that what we think is important is this reflective space in which humans can think about things and decide things. And it's the ability to form second order preferences that makes us special, that we think is morally significant. Fourthly, we think that the thing that you ought to do is the thing that is rationally required, right? We say I've made a mistake if I know that eating breakfast is the best thing for me, but I was angry or I was tired and I decided not to, which means we think the fact that these emotional phenomenological effects, the way that you feel at the time, are actually not making you do the correct thing. So those are 4 reasons why I don't think we believe the way things make you feel is a special thing. What is much more important is let me find this this page, what people would do and their preferences if they were not conscious. That is the thing they were trying to optimize for. What does opening opposition say on this point? The first thing they say is that there is a feeling of satisfaction that comes from having beers with your mates, and we think beers with your mates are good. We are okay saying beers with the mates are important, but there is a debate, right? It can be good because I like the feeling, or it can be good because I am happy at that point in time. My goals have been realized. One of my second order goals is to have good social relationships, to enjoy the little things in life. It could be the case that even if I did not have the phenomenological quality of having beers with the mates, it would still be a good outcome. So it's entirely consistent with our side. Secondly, they say when you talk about agency, right? It's good for me to know whether or not I was in love, whether or not I did enjoy this thing. But I think, again, this is an assertion about what matters. Because if what matters is optimizing for my second order preferences and not optimizing for what gives me feelings of happiness or feelings of sadness, then it is more important to know what my second order preferences are, not obscured by the feelings that they caused, rather than to know the way it made me feel. I think similarly, right? I could have feelings of nostalgia for a past relationship, even though I know intuitively it was very bad for me. It is sort of open question why it is better for me to have those feelings of nostalgia. We claim it obscures your ability to know what is important. Thirdly, they say you cannot consent to this state of not knowing, right? Presumably, people know what they're giving up, right? And they don't know what it could be. But I don't know why we're in a position to decide what is better or worse for them, because they're the ones that know the status quo. This is consistent with the idea that you can take alcohol or drugs. Why then do we win this debate? Firstly, I think in terms of optimizing for the things people want to do, the things that their second order preferences dictate, it is a huge benefit not to force them to undergo these phenomenological qualities that prevent them from choosing. I wish I were better at debate, and it would be better for me if I did a bunch of matter prep and a bunch of OGs. But in the moment, I don't really want to do that. But absent these feelings of concern for what I want to do based merely on this fact of experience, I am much more likely to do the things that higher level Greg, smarter Greg, actually wants me to do. Secondly, I think we justify why OG is correct, that we're fine for people to go into the Black Mirror episode and do the vast majority of their work taking these drugs. Because if they decide that taking the shitty job that causes them pain actually is better for them, we think it would be easier if they did not have this experience of pain that intervened and prevented them from doing the thing they really wanted to. But thirdly, because I think this makes it the fact that we are now likely to give more power to the higher level self means it's so much easier to become good at things, right? I think boredom, the fact that you don't like acquiring the skills you think you need, is a huge drag on people acquiring better productivity. So in terms of the objective lived experiences, the fact that it's so much easier for people to educate themselves, to work hard, to become productive, makes it much more likely that their second order preferences are met. They're more likely to advance and do better with respect to their objective conditions. Opening.
Remembering exactly what it was like to feel the way you felt is obviously vastly different to having a vague impression that you were happy, you think maybe, and then having to reverse engineer why you may have been to figure out your preferences.
One, given your reasons why, you get evidence about something that doesn't really matter, but two, that the thing you get evidence of might prevent you from focusing on what does matter, your rational ability to comprehend the things that have happened to you in the past. So for those reasons, I don't think that POI stands. Finally, what makes bad things bad? We think most people have good times and bad times. One, because you get accustomed to some new status quo, so then variations above and below cause happiness and sadness. But two, there are obviously evolutionary reasons for things to bring you joy and for them to bring you sadness. Our claim is that bad times prevents the vast majority of people from enjoying good times. So if the Irish are correct that what we want is people to enjoy beers with the mates, that's less likely to happen if you remember the time you got broken up with or some other traumatic event. One, because I think a large number of people have huge amounts of anxiety, for instance, or past social interactions or times they engaged in similar behaviors that went wrong that are quite hard for you to overcome subsequently. But secondly, because bad things are often overwhelming for a large number of people, you keep thinking about the time that this bad thing happened, and that prevents you from then going back to your family, enjoying hanging out with them to the fullest extent possible. An important premise I think OG missed here is why people in general are good at knowing when they're likely to have good or bad times, because that is really important. And we say it is likely to be the case because most of our lives follow a repeating pattern, right? We don't have a large amount of choice. I have to go back to hang out with my family. I have to go to work day and hang out with this employer who might misgender me, for instance, if I'm trans, right? These are the experiences that people know and are aware of and are able to predict, which means that people under our side are able to protect their good times by allowing themselves to forget the bad times that prevent them from recovering, enjoying the good life as we know it. Proud to propose.
All right, great. I would like to thank the member of government for their speech. I would like to invite the member of opposition to deliver their speech. Here.
Great. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yes.
Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things from closing opposition. Firstly, framing on why people are going to use this drug a lot, and I posit why that's bad. Then identity, then why this drug exacerbates social inequality and exploitation massively, going beyond the one-liners we heard from opening opposition. On framing, why will this drug be used a lot? Firstly, there are loads of incentives from institutions to promote this, i.e. corporations, governments, and so on, and sell this because it is a productivity maximizing drug. As Naomi points out, it probably makes you more efficient at work because now you are immune to emotional distractions, you intake information far better in the absence of external stimuli, and generally speaking, you are less likely to suffer the lower order harms that Greg talks about, such as microaggressions on a day-to-day basis, and suffer from them and therefore to be more productive. Secondly, there is likely to be a prisoner's dilemma on a global scale, whereby you don't want to be the odd person out not trying it, insofar as this is likely quite novel, the legalization of it is quite novel, and it likely spurs people to put social pressure on you to take it more. Thirdly, legalization comes with things like massive amounts of ads, corporate lobbying, like ads on TikTok encouraging you to buy this, ads in public on billboards encouraging you to buy this, states promoting it to an extent, and I'll explain why they have incentive to do that in a minute, and corporations promoting it to a massive degree with large amounts of money. Fourthly, there's a general trend towards liberalization of other drugs in Western society. This means that people who try other drugs are often probably tempted to try this. And fifthly, there's just a massive political incentive for people in authoritarian regimes to make this accessible because it can make the population far more compliant. I know Kat says you probably join a union anyway, but insofar as a lot of people probably will, want to take this a fair amount, if you have regular intermittent gaps in your consciousness, it's probably the case that you're vastly more content with your day-to-day life and probably far less likely to agitate for that. And even if you aren't, politicians have an incentive to believe that this is true and then market this to you insofar as it makes you more compliant with your day-to-day life, and they're in bed with the big corporations under capitalism. So I think it will be quite widespread in use, and I think that that's fairly important to note in the debate. Why is it a moral wrong for the state to legalize this? In this response to Princeton, I think that we agree in this debate that the state exists as a vehicle for people to be preference maximizing. That is, it exists in order to secure basic rights for people to access the idea of the good life. Our claim is that drift is an assault on your innermost identity, and the state should not allow people to violate their consciousness on this scale. I do think consciousness is extremely valuable, unlike Greg. I think dogs are cute. I have one. Her name is Gracie, and she's adorable. You can DM me and I'll send you pictures. Also, we do consider consciousness important. It's how we determine things like power of attorney when you're signing over the guardianship of people, and whether or not parents are in the right state of mind to care for children. So I do think it's societally important. Why is consciousness important in this instance? Most of your identity is socially constructed. That is, the reason I am who I am is the result of people's external information influencing me and me updating my behavior and calibrating it to people on that basis. Insofar as that is true, I think this constitutes identity erasure insofar as it robs you of the ability to process new information in the intervening span of time that otherwise might change your decision-making calculus, and therefore makes it vastly more difficult for you to be able to access information. This is important for CG because CG hints their case on second-order preferences. The problem is preferences form over time and people evolve over time. If you opt out of life for a few weeks using this drug, your preferences very easily could have shifted radically due to the intake of a new set of information. There can on your higher order of the drug and not the interval after. Insofar as we don't know whether the thing you get evidence of, as Greg calls it, is good or bad, we think we should default to providing people with the most information because the maximum amount of information allows people to access and self-select into their conception of the good life far better. Insofar as this robs you a massive amount of information about yourself, not just from others, because it means you can no longer process the stimuli around other people, i.e. how they perceive you and then react differently. This is a violation of your identity on a mass scale and a violation of the identity of every single person who takes it. But secondly, I think these things are not temporary influences on your identity. They're permanent and cloud your self-perception for good. Because when you come down from a trip in this drug, you're likely to regard the circumstances you're in as very different to you, because insofar as your preferences, even if they were lower order, as Greg said, had shifted from where you were before, there is now cognitive dissonance between the person you were a few weeks ago and the person there. That is, you have new skills that you don't know where you picked up before. You have new, potentially, things in your life that you otherwise didn't know. You now know something that you didn't otherwise know, and that might change the way you act. I think this causes a massive amount of cognitive dissonance between your inner self and your outer experiences. I think that's very bad for your identity, insofar as it's like a violation of preferences to a massive extent. Before I go on and explain why this exacerbates social inequality to a massive extent, I'll take a
People won't take the drug if their life has a tolerable mix of good and bad because they want to enjoy things. For people whose antidepressants don't work or they're undergoing physical pain like chemotherapy, they are suffering far too much to healthily introspect.
I'll respond to all of this in extension. Opening opposition in DLO says on massive social inequality that populism and workplace mobilization happen more when when you're using this drug at massive rates. This isn't enough to win the debate. What actually happens? Firstly, people who use this drug are probably more impoverished people who hate their jobs, as Naomi just pointed out in the POI. When you take this drug, it makes it far more bearable, and when you legalize it, you probably use it in a widespread manner as opening government concedes. This means you're just far less likely to have the time and capacity to engage in things as often with conversations about HR, about how bad your job is. You're far less likely to have a chance to establish connections like friendships and networking, because the intermittent use of this drug robs you of memories of how you acquired information, therefore collective sources of bonding with people, and so on and so forth. This doesn't mean when you maximize it at scale that you get way less collective mobilization, because even if it is the case there are higher order preferences accord with joining a union, the union is likely far less productive at the point at which you have this intermittent blanking in and out of consciousness. That means it is far less able for those people to mobilize. The comparative is that people whose lives are okay, i.e. wealthy and rich people, don't use it as often, and therefore can mobilize to collectivize systemic oppression under capitalism far easier. But finally, the people who use this the most are probably people who now can't collectivize to get better workplace conditions because their conditions are the most dire. Secondly, it exacerbates existing privilege, right? Because even if poor and wealthy people took it at the same rate, which we dispute, rich people are less dependent on things like workplace protections, affirmative action, networking that develops in adult age, because they come with pre-existing backgrounds that facilitate privilege from step one. That is to say, they are born with their networks rather than make that. Insofar as people periodically opt in and out of life at various intervals, we think that rich people are better able to cope with the gaps in their memory in order to advance socially than people without structural disadvantage. I want you to take this impact and then maximize it out and aggregate it out at scale. What this means is that even if it is the case that we don't get to claim that people are using it all the time, that they're opting out of life constantly, the fact that it means that many poor people miss that one chance they otherwise would have gotten to have a network that lifted them to the top, to make a connection with the person that became their boss, that lifted them out of poverty, to write the great essay that got them into Harvard, Yale, whatever college. This means there's far fewer people who are doing that well. You have far fewer people advancing in society. But thirdly, a population has regular and consistent access to this drug is far more willing to resort to staying content with things in life. Because the majority of people aren't terminally depressed, but they are unsatisfied in life. It's significantly easier to mobilize for political action and fight back for redistributive systems that create equality in a world far more frequently when it's the case that you are able to tap into collective grievance. At the point at which you individualize grievance experiences far more, because now people are opting out of forming the connections around those shared experiences more frequently, it is harder to build those connections with people and therefore those networks to push for collective action for wealth redistribution. Insofar as the world where it is legal is when you get less things like progressive tax, less things like welfare redistribution frequently, we think that's quite bad. But finally, I do think it's bad for people with mental illnesses who aren't well, because the people who are mentally unwell is that often they need to seek help. But this compounds your trauma, which often seems to be at a biological level, but now you can't tell where it came from. It's harder to preempt trauma because you have a hard time identifying things like triggers and things like this. And it's far harder for you to seek out help in therapy because you're less likely to make those kinds of connections in the first place with people who would facilitate you going to therapy. For all of those reasons, incredibly proud to stand in closing opposition.
All right, great. I would like to thank the member of opposition for their speech. And I would like to invite the government to deliver their speech. Here.
Hello, I generally have a very strong preference for people having their cameras on, regardless of whether you're a debater, an observer, or a judge, just because it makes me happier. And also, I take you as exclusively visually. There are lots of people here, so if I'm not taking you, just do the raise hand function so you come to the top. The first thing I want to talk to you about is agency, control, the ability to be the person you want to be. Greg tells you why we're able to uniquely access this on our side, because we're dominated by impulses that we don't like. And they also tell you why this is probably the most important impact in the round. To be clear, if you buy this claim, you should place us cleanly above OG, because they also have a claim on autonomy about how the ability to choose the drug is also something that restricts your autonomy. But I think that Greg's claim is much more significant with regards to agency for three reasons. The first is it applies to a much larger subset of choices, because it's not about specifically the ability to take one drug, but a spectrum of choices all throughout your life in terms of like whether or not you want to, for example, study X subject, whether or not you want to do Y hobby, whether or not you want to take a risk and pursue Z person, which might change the outcome of your life, for example. But second of all, because our choices are far more proximate to our personhood, not all choices are created equal. And that's why the government is perfectly okay to restrict certain drugs in the status quo, because the inability to consume that one drug is a negative choice that doesn't really affect our quality of life. Whereas something that is positive and our ability to make choices in general is extremely important, because in the absence of that, we are constrained in everything we do and cannot fully be a person. But the final reason for this is because I think our underlying reason for why choice matters is just much more compelling, because I think that their claim that, we have to, that because we didn't opt into life and capitalism, therefore we ought to be able to maximize choices elsewhere is, general. And I think that maybe you buy this, but I think it is pretty high burden, because the logical conclusion of that claim is necessarily that we should be able to make any choice that we want. But second of all, relatively to speaking, for our side, we're explaining why this choice is necessary for you to control yourself and who you are. And that's much, much, much more important for a few reasons. The first thing is, your personhood and yourself is oftentimes the most important part of your existence. And what matters not just for yourself, but also for the way you interact with other people. And the intuition pump for this is because I think that people are okay with experiencing pain in the short term. We can endure that. We're willing to do that. And the bottom line, though, is we're unwilling to do things that go against what we want ourselves. And the reason for this is because that takes away who we are, and it makes our lives unimportant and irrelevant. Because in the absence of our ability to do what we want with our lives, then it really doesn't make a very, very big difference what happens to us. Before I go further, I'll take the point from OO.
Our idea of what we want for our life is fundamentally shaped by our emotional experiences, like spending less time at work to spend it with loved ones. You make second-order preferences less meaningful, less accurate, and less valuable.
Mm-hmm. So let's just talk about the responses to this, right? Because OO say and then CO repeat the very idea about information, right? Two responses to this. The first thing is that both of these teams are dependent on this claim that you have to be taking these drugs all the time. And I think that the importance of this claim for CO is not only that, you can't access information, but also their extension about, revolution and making working conditions better. Few responses to this. The first thing is their reasons for why you take this all the time are incredibly flimsy and undermined by their own analysis. So number one, CO gives us this big other 1984 kind of analysis that is like, because corporations and the government want you to do this because it's profitable, therefore they're going to give you an unrelenting advertising campaign which will force you to take these drugs. Two responses to this. The first and most obvious response is there's a whole spectrum of things that would be good for us to do. The government, for example, it would also be good if, it would also be good, for example, for the government to pass certain laws that make us work universal working days, for example. And we rejected this, obviously, when the labor unions formed. And the intuitive reason for this is because it caused a visceral reaction of unhappiness and upset in so many people that, it really, really meant that they organized against it. But the second reason for this is also just because I think that the government actually steers clear of doing things and restricting freedoms and compelling people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, unless there's an extremely important public health reason for this that will substantially harm people. And the reason for this is because presumably this debate mostly applies to democratic countries, because of the rules of debating. And then governments probably win on election. And I think that how easy it is to say this is probably not great means that electoral incentives means governments probably don't push this scheme. I also just believe that profitability isn't a reason for companies to push this, just because profitability motivates companies insofar as they want to survive and when they want to grow. The thing is, though, that this is a competitive process and it's relative to other companies. So for their neck to happen, it would require the entire workforce to jump towards the state. But the absence of that, individual companies have no pressing need to make this gross change because other companies aren't outcompeting them. So for those reasons, I don't think the profit motive is sufficient to compel people to take this. Even if there were a profit motive for this, I don't think governments have the ability to do this without incurring massive unhappiness. Okay, so second of all, then, I also just think that it's up to people to choose a lot of the time whether or not they want to take this drug or not. And I think that the reason this matters then is that because it's very difficult for them to prove that people are forced to take this, but finally, and notably, their side champions the idea of social reform, but this is hung on force on people having no other choice, i.e., life is really, really bad. That pushes me to campaign, to be an activist, to make in order to attain a future that I think is better for me because I want to alleviate this suffering. I think that this is a very roundabout way of alleviating pain. Yes, some people want to do that because they think it's meaningful to change conditions for themselves and for everyone else. But other people will prioritize spending time at home or pursuing other goals that are important to them instead. And giving them that choice is what is best. But finally, I also just think that these problems are often very, very intractable. People who are oppressed have less power, less money, less time. I think all of these reasons means that it's very difficult for them to overhaul the system as well. So for all of those reasons, I do think that people take this all the time, and I do think that CEO gets the social outcomes we're talking about. But second of all, then, I also just think that information is unimportant towards being able to make a choice and have agency and control over yourself. And the reason for this is because information is always, always imperfect. You don't know what the future holds. Agency is about being able to make your own choice given the information that you yourself have at the time. And the reason this is true is because people feel upset and frustrated when they are unable to make a choice because they know that there's another one that they would prefer. And in the absence of that, they suffer. I think that being able to do what you want and be who you want to be is the only thing that is valuable in the world. For these reasons, happy to propose.
All right, great. I would like to thank the government whip for their speech. I would like to invite the opposition whip to wrap up the debate. Here.
Just one second. I'm just gonna. Cool. I will probably ask for POI to sacrifice something. Also, I'm going to have to be responding to some of the things that OG said, so that's going to be some of the discussion about mental health in my speech as well. It's going to be towards the start. Happy to mute me in case that's not comfortable. Cool. Going to do a couple of things in this speech. Quickly to CG. Secondly, some of the responses about mental health and trauma. Thirdly, why this drug is going to be used on quite large scale, but that even if not, why that's still bad. Then on social inequality and harms. All the response is going to be either explicit or quite integral. And on closing government and the idea about the higher order preferences, the first thing I want to point out is that we are generally unclear as to why they are making this distinction between higher and lower order preferences. Some people, maybe who are hedonistic, might be caring about the lower order. I'm unclear what the difference is. But also note, Matt responds to all of their case in detail. The issue with CG is that they assume that at the point where you are taking this drug, the higher order preferences are going to be staying the same. The problem is that it's much harder to be planning for the higher order things when your consciousness is being regularly interrupted. The issue is that your preferences, the higher order preferences, could have shifted quite dramatically over the time that you are on this drug because of the information that you could have intaken. You do not get that, on their side, they do not get that, so they do not know how much of that preference would shift. Because of that, we should err on the side that just provides the most information that's on the external CG. On the mental health things, opening government says that it is better if you do not remember exactly what the issues that you had are or the traumatic event is. And it's better if you just feel somewhat uneasy than if you feel very overwhelming. I'm going to give a couple of responses to this. The first thing is that it does not make you feel uneasy. The issue is that even if you lack the memory, your physical response and quite drastic physical response is still there because your nervous system, even if you don't consciously remember, your nervous system does. The problem with that is as follows. You're still having a quite horrible reaction, but you can't really fix it for a couple of reasons. One, because you can't pre-prepare yourself. You do not know what exactly is the thing that triggers you. In many cases, you just do not. not, you do not have the exact memory about what it is. Because of that, you do not know what to avoid. Secondly, you can't explain to other people about what is the issue that you are dealing with, what exactly triggers you, and how they should be behaving around you. In many cases, this means that people do not really understand you, and sometimes they withdraw from you because you're just confusing them. Because of that, you might be losing contacts and people that you care about. That multiplies the level of mental health issues that you have. Thirdly, on therapy, it is like the way in which therapy works in many cases is that you have to remember that event in detail and try to update it with the new information that you now know. You can't do that at the point where a lot of your things are just removed from your consciousness. The last thing on this, in many cases, what trauma or just having mental issues does to you is that as a response, you withdraw and you try to forget what the kind of, or you don't try to take into account what your physical response is, how your body feels, like what your consciousness feels, what actually makes you uncomfortable, because it's too overwhelming. The problem with that is that you don't, like you forget, you don't understand what makes you uncomfortable anymore. You don't understand how you should be setting your boundaries and what you should be focusing on. Or this means that more and more bad things are happening to you without you having the chance to interpret them. They multiplies. What opening government does is give a very short-term band-aid that actually doesn't solve much, but amplifies this in the long term massively. It's really uncomfortable, but I think we do flip that. Why is this drug going to be used on a massive scale? Opening government says that you're going to be able to efficiently consent because you remember how the consciousness is. I think Matt gives you a bunch of reasons that go long beyond the opening opposition claim about lobbying as to why people are likely to be using it quite a lot. The first thing is that institutions and companies are likely to be providing for productivity. This is not that you're going to have some massive advertising campaigns or whatever the way that CG describes it. That sounds quite ridiculous. It's things like including into your healthcare plans, like pushing this in that kind of more subtle way. I think that's much more realistic. But secondly, Matt explains that there is a prisoner's dilemma, both because of the fact that it's a sort of novel legalization that people want to try, but also because there's a competition thing, right? Everyone agrees that this will probably make you more productive. People are going to be scared that if everyone else takes it and they are not the ones who are taking it, they will be the ones who are going to fall behind and are not going to be nearly as productive. This means that people are going to be pushed into taking it a lot. Also, on compliance, on keeping it constantly, because you get used to the fact that you don't have the small annoyances. You get used to the fact that you don't have to do emotional labor and other kinds of labor, and you just don't feel that tired. It means that you're much more likely to be taking it constantly because you do not have those feelings to come back. On the weighing, right? I'm not sure if experience is always utility positive or sometimes there is pain. I think the way that we actually explain it is when Matt explains why you are likely to be taking it to a large extent of time. It means that to the extent that most of the time is utility positive and it's not always just pain, people take it enough that it actually matters. On the harms on social inequality, Matt explains to you as to why this massively reduces social mobility, especially at work, right? Opening opposition says that inequality might happen because poorer people might not have access to the drug. I think that via the framing that we give, people are likely going to have access to this. Matt explains to you why inequality then happens regardless. The reason is that you have lack of access as a result of not having that consciousness. You have lack of access to things that you would be able to get a promotion from. For example, networking, talking to HR, just getting that contacts that usually necessitate for people to climb from a lower position to a higher one. How this weighs against opening government? Firstly, working conditions get significantly worse. Oh, but you can say, but you're taking this drug, why do you give a shit that working conditions get worse? One, because there is a physical wearing of your body. Now you're working in worse conditions. This affects later parts of your life because you're more likely to be ill, more likely to be tired and feeling awful while you're not on that drug. Secondly, longer working hours, right? If hours get longer, it diminishes your capacity to enjoy the stuff outside of the horrible capitalism that opening government describes. Secondly, this removes your chances from improving your life outside of work, right? Before I go into that, I'll take opening government.
Look, you want people to experience life-informed preferences and act on them to improve their life. Note that doesn't happen for people who, for the reasons Naomi explains, are very widespread, don't actually have access to being able to think about those things properly, nor indeed change the structures under which they live.
Look, I think in the vast majority of instances, there are incentives to give provision of things like being able to help people with this. Most people are going to be able to access the help to some extent. You are multiplying those problems for people with having a very short-term band-aid that actually doesn't fix anything. Why does removes your chances to improving life outside of work, right? The thing with being poor under capitalism is it often translates outside of work. If you are poor at your work, you often also feel anxious, hungry, etc. unless you take it all the time, you will have to go through some pain anyway. What opening government does is that they remove a chance from people to actually get better social conditions in the long term, meaning that even if you're avoiding some struggle on opening government, you are also forfeiting all your chances to make some sort of long-term happiness, get more money, get more preferences as a result of this. This all multiplies because it also creates pressure on people who did not consent to it. So I guess that we are weighing over opening opposition on scale. I'm saying this as a tribute to Jessica Mussolin. Lastly, also less ability to be having collective grievances translated to actual policy change. All of those reasons, just fact that you're having a short-term mandate, meaning that you are forfeiting a huge amount of social development as a result. CO.
All right, great. I would like to thank the opposition whip for this speech and everyone for